This long theoretical ramble was brought to you by caffeine. Most of you have likely heard of the Dark Triad. This describes personalities and personality traits that are considered malevolent, toxic, or damaging in some way. When you take these traits and push them to an extreme, whether that's in the severity of them or the number of them that a person possesses, you can get a diagnosable condition. Certain psychopathic traits, after a particular threshold or severity, become diagnosable as antisocial personality disorder. The same goes for certain narcissistic traits, which have narcissistic personality disorder as an associated condition. Then you have Machiavellianism, which is an unusual category because it overlaps in some ways with the previous two, but does not actually have an associated condition with it. So, at least in theory, you can be very Machiavellian without ever being diagnosable with the condition. This got me thinking. Psychopaths and narcissists are interesting. However, only up to a point. Their pathologies make them kind of predictable. They are fixed in some ways. Then there are certain people, be they real life or fictional characters, that are more grey, ambiguous, morally flexible, and Machiavellian. My caffeine-fueled ponderings lately have me asking 3 questions. Number 1, how dark can a person go without having a personality disorder? Number 2, can you be what I'm going to call a philosophical psychopath? Number 3, for our more power-hungry subscribers, you know who you are. How dark should you go or be willing to go? You know, just some light-hearted stuff. The first question actually is pretty easy to answer. There are countless examples of normal people being capable of doing terrible things. The famous Milgram experiment showed that simply due to blind obedience of authority, people were willing to administer what would have been a fatal electric shock to another person. Entire societies can be brainwashed or simply threatened and bullied into behaving in horrendous ways. People can also go dark of their own volition, such as someone seeking vengeance on someone who has wronged them. So having a personality disorder is definitely not a requirement for a person to step across that line into darkness or immorality. But in all of those cases I mentioned, there is some kind of trigger, something that acts upon a person to make them behave in some ways against their natural inclinations, against their nature. Philosophical psychopaths. One fictional example of a philosophical psychopath, at least in some versions, would be the character of the Joker. Although he's often psychotic or just crazy, he is someone who has come to view the societal systems that have been built, including morality itself, as fundamentally meaningless or a joke. And depending on which backstory you're reading, he starts off as someone who is a normal person. And in many ways, he is akin to someone having an existential or philosophical crisis. So in some sense, I see the character of the Joker not as someone who has developed a mental illness, but someone who has simply adopted a new belief system about life. So could you philosophically reason your way out of morality? Let's play this out. One view could be that morality is an artificial construct, something humans have superimposed onto a world that doesn't really abide by moral law. In some sense, that is true, but to call it an artificial construct is kind of misleading. Our sense of morality, despite the fact that it varies greatly across time and through culture, is rooted in our biology. Certain things such as violence, betrayal, unfairness, etc., bring about negative emotional responses within us. So over time, we mold societies in a way that finds a compromise between mitigating those negative emotions whilst retaining enough freedom. A society that does those things is more likely to be stable and survive, and therefore outcompete other societal models. There's a famous Churchill quote which says, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." This quote describes the cyclical nature between what we construct as humans and how those things can then constrict us. You could philosophically see the sense of morality we've constructed in this way, something we've made that in some ways holds us back. If morality can be boiled down to simply our emotional response to things, you could see it as being as irrational as any other emotional response. For example, if you were on a diet, you'd be in a situation where your emotions and your desires are not necessarily working in your favor. The impulse to stuff your face full of unhealthy food is clearly one worth ignoring. So, theoretically, if you wanted to do something that violated the conventional sense of morality, for whatever reason, maybe it benefited you in some way, and you knew you could get away with this particular thing, all you'd need to do is reason yourself out of, or ignore the emotions associated with it, which is usually guilt. Then you would be unbound by morality. Now, this doesn't ever really happen. Even extreme nihilists who think that life is fundamentally meaningless rarely live out this philosophy fully. Game theory. I think this is because human beings innately lean towards being good. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of reasons to be cynical about human nature, but let me explain why I think this. Being generally good is the best life strategy. The word generally is quite important in that sentence. There were two famous tournaments around 1980 in which computer programs competed against each other. These programs had to play against each other in the prisoner's dilemma. If you haven't heard of that before, feel free to look that up elsewhere. But they did so repeatedly, over and over, in an iterated way. This meant that the computer programs involved had a memory of what happened in the previous round. So for example, if they were betrayed in the last round of the prisoner's dilemma, they could store that fact. The basic aim was to find out which life strategy would work best. What is the best formula to use to interact over time and deal with things like cooperation and the risk of betrayal. The winning strategy, or program, turned out to actually be the simplest one, which was called tit for tat. Now, I realise that is actually, I think, a British saying. Tit for tat is kind of like an eye for an eye. This program was designed to choose cooperation first, then replicate the opponent's last move. So if the opponent was cooperative, tit for tat would cooperate. And if its opponent chose to betray it, it would do the same back to it in the next round. Basically, start off being nice, but if someone punches you, punch back. That outcompeted all of the other complex programs. Very simple, very elegant, and also the most successful and common strategy used by humans. It would seem that our default programming, so to speak, is to be cooperative, to be altruistic in that reciprocal way. But if we are wronged, we want to retaliate. Minority strategies. However, it's quite clear there are people out there with psychopathic and Machiavellian traits that in some cases are doing pretty well. In evolutionary theory, there are things called minority strategies. These are unusual or less common life approaches and strategies. Certain species or certain members of a species adopt them to take advantage of the fact that the vast majority are doing something different. The traits of being devious, being callous, being manipulative, cunning, deceitful, putting power above personal relationships, being cutthroat, ruthless, and just generally Machiavellian. Those can be viewed as minority strategies. Because most people by default are good, they don't always see people with these traits coming. It can almost be unthinkable that there are people out there with those kinds of malevolent traits. Machiavelli. Well, that was a long tangent. Anyway, Niccolo Machiavelli was, among other things, an Italian diplomat and writer during the Renaissance period. His famous or infamous book, entitled The Prince, was a how-to book for acquiring and keeping political power. His advice and teachings are characterized by being amoral and often ruthless, with famous quotes including, "Politics have no relation to morals," and "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." So I'm going to revisit Machiavelli and his teachings both in the original form and the modern day books that are based on them. But I'm curious. It's no secret that I sometimes descend into the comment section to seek out nuggets of wisdom. So if you're all in a confessional mood, feel free to comment below with any examples from your life where you've adopted a Machiavellian approach. Or alternatively, if you want to maintain your saintly reputations, feel free to leave a comment about some Machiavellian behaviour you've witnessed. Also, if you could assist my power-hungry tendencies and like and subscribe if you haven't already, then you will be rewarded in some vague and unspecified way.